This video is the second in a series of videos that I've recorded for you this week that are meant to help you with reading scholarship, specifically with reading academic journal articles. At this time, you should have already watched and listened to the narrated PowerPoint that I recorded for you that taught you what are the common features of an academic journal article, what are the purposes of those features, and what are reading strategies you can use in order to navigate and read an article efficiently. For this week, I asked you to read the article, Do Course Evaluations Truly Reflect Student Learning? Evidence from an Objectively Graded Post-Test, so that you could apply what you were learning about reading scholarship to an actual piece of published literature. So what I want to do now in this video is step you through this article, looking at the features that you learned about in the PowerPoint presentation. And in the third video for this week about reading scholarship, what I'll do is actually break down the content for you. So I'm hoping that these three videos working together will really help show you some strategies for what you're looking for when you read an academic article, so that you can most effectively and efficiently read the scholarship that you will need to use throughout the semester for all of your projects. So first, you'll notice that we do have the journal title provided for us, and it's actually provided for us in two places on this front page. So we get it once here at the top of the page, and it's centered, and of course it's in smaller print compared to the other text. And then it also appears bolded and in larger font here in this colored bar. If you remember from the presentation, I told you that the journal title will often appear in the top left or right corner of the first page of an article, although sometimes it will appear elsewhere at the top, at the bottom, or on the second page. The presence of the journal title is especially useful if you download a PDF of this article to your computer, or if you print a copy. That way you can easily and accurately cite the source without needing to go back and search for it in a database or go to the journal site and search through that. You'll notice that to the right of the journal title here at the very top of the page is this number 31, which is the volume number of the article. You'll see that an issue number has not been included for us, which, if you remember from the presentation, that sometimes happens. Sometimes all we know are the volume number as well as the publication year. But those two pieces working together could still enable us to locate this article if we were to go directly to the journal's website. You'll notice that we do have the publication year provided for us to the right of the volume number, and it is listed in parentheses. And then to the right of the publication year, we have the page numbers of this article. And of course, this is the inclusive page numbering system here, because we know the article starts on page 709 and ends on page 719. There are some features here at the top of this first page that are not necessarily common to all journal articles. One is here on the left side. Elsevier is the publisher of this particular journal, and Elsevier is one of the leading academic publishers. Others include Taylor and Francis, Wiley, and Routledge. And what's a bit unusual is that not only do we know the publisher name, but we also have their icon here. You won't always have the publisher icon included for you. That's probably because it's not really necessary. It doesn't really contribute anything to the article, but sometimes you will see it. You'll also see that we have the front cover of the journal. And again, that's a feature. Sometimes you'll see it, sometimes you won't. And it's just sort of there. It adds some visual interest, but it doesn't really do anything as far as enhancing your understanding of the article or giving you any new information. Another feature that's included here at the top of the page that you will not always see is the URL for the journal homepage. This is relatively common, but you won't see it in all articles. What's really useful about having this URL here, though, is that if you want to access the journal, instead of having to do a web search for it or get to it through a database, all you have to do is just use the clickable link. So it's a really convenient feature for a researcher. And remember that sometimes you'll find a source published in a journal that's a really great source, and so it may be useful to go to that journal and see if there are other articles similar to the one that you have that are published in that particular location. So below the colored bar, we see that we have the title of the journal, the title of the journal article, which is Do Course Evaluations Truly Reflect Student Learning? And here we have a subtitle, Evidence from an Objectively Graded Post-Test. Please note that below the title, we have the names of our authors, and we have 3. And it's really important whenever you have a source that is co-authored like this that you follow the ordering of the names that are listed. You don't ever want to try and rearrange that order, especially if the ordering is not alphabetical, which it is here. But if it's not alphabetical, don't rearrange it to make it alphabetical. These authors are listed in this order for a reason. The way this ordering works is that in this case we have 3 authors. So this person is the first author, that would be how they're referred to. Then we have the second author, and then we have the third author. And whoever's listed first is the author who receives the most credit for the article. So this person may have been responsible or mostly responsible for the research design of the study and or the majority of the writing of the article. So that person will receive the most credit. So you want to make sure that whenever you're preparing your citation that that person is listed first. So don't rearrange the names. Always follow the order that's provided. If you recall from the presentation, it's common not just to have the author's names, but also to know their affiliations as well as their credentials. And in this particular article, we don't have the credentials of the authors, but we do know their affiliations. To the right of the last name for each of these authors, we have a superscript. So we have this small a, and then we have 2 small b's here. And if you go directly below the author's names, you'll see the matching superscripts. And that's where we're finding out their affiliations. So we know the first author, Trinidad de Leche, that affiliation is the Food and Drug Administration. And then for Ferris and Marks, their affiliation is with the Department of Economics at the University of California, Riverside. As I mentioned in the presentation, generally your author's affiliations will be with universities or colleges, but sometimes the affiliations are with agencies or organizations. And initially, for this article, it may seem a bit odd that one author works for the FDA and that de Leche, who is that author, is listed as the first author, rather than either of the other 2 who are affiliated with the university. However, if you were to Google de Leche's name, you would actually find a curriculum vitae or a CV, which is the academic version of a resume, that indicates this author's prior university affiliation. The author's affiliations, they're not needed for citation purposes, but they are useful if you want to mention them in the paper you are writing, as well as to help establish the credibility of the research of the article. You're more likely to trust the research findings of someone affiliated with the university, for example, who's considered an expert in the subject area, than you are someone who is not such an expert. So having that information is really useful. And in this case, the actual addresses are also provided for you. So presumably if you wanted to write to any of these particular authors, you could send them a letter to contact them. If you scroll down below the author information, you'll also see some features that again are uncommon, as well as some that are common to most articles. So first you see we have this heading of article info, and below that we have this section called article history. This is actually atypical, at least if we're talking about across disciplines. It may be common within the economics discipline, but if we're talking about across disciplines, it's not often that you see the article history. And what this is it shows us the date when this article was first submitted for review, all the way up to the date when it was actually accepted for publication. So we can tell from the history that the first peer review of the article, it must have resulted in a revise and resubmit recommendation, because we're learning that this article was received in a revised form on December 31st. And we can also tell based off of the acceptance date that presumably the revisions the authors made were sufficient enough, or if additional revisions were needed beyond those, then they were minor, in order for the second round of review to result in a decision to publish. Note that although you can expect academic journal articles to undergo the peer review process, you generally won't know what the timeline is that process entails for the article to become published. So this is, again, a fairly unusual feature to see. Another uncommon feature outside of this discipline is seeing the JEL classification. JEL stands for the Journal of Economic Literature, which was responsible for creating this classification system. And basically, this system is used to code journals in economics. And because this article is published in an economics journal, it's appropriate that this system was used. Though again, you won't always see this classification information, even in some economic journal articles. 2 features that are common in this section of the article, though, are first of all the keywords that are listed here, as well as the abstract that appears here. And the keywords are terms or phrases that the authors and or the journal consider to be appropriate search terms to locate the article. So if you were to access the journal website and search for course evaluations, for example, this first keyword, then what you would find is that this article would appear somewhere in the results. If you remember from the presentation, the abstract is just a short summary of the article, and it's almost always included at the top of the first page of an article. So notice that this abstract does include the features I mentioned in the presentation. It starts with that broad kind of contextualizing background information. It opens by explaining that it's challenging to determine from course evaluations the extent to which students have actually learned, because valid measures of learning are rarely available, as they say right here. And then notice that the next sentence then starts to tell us about the purpose of the article and what it contributes that makes it stand out compared to the prior literature. So what the contribution is that this article makes, or this research makes, is that it gives us a new tool or a new measure for capturing actual student learning. The third sentence is where we start to move into a summary of the methods that the authors use to obtain their results. And then the last sentence is where we find out what the main finding is. So you can tell from this abstract that it does follow the different moves that I told you an abstract does. And it sets you up really well to understand what this article is about without having to actually read the entire article. Let's look now at the organization of the article's main content. So first, you'll notice that the introduction is labeled and it's also assigned a number. Remember that introductions are not always titled in articles, and sometimes they're a combination of introductory content as well as literature review. The second section of the article appears on the next page, and it is also numbered, as are all of the sections, so I'll no longer comment on this feature. But this section is labeled. Notice that it's titled Institutional Description and Data, and although it has this specific title, it actually begins what we would typically refer to as a methods or methodology section, because it starts to get into what was the research site, who were the participants, etc. Remember that although articles tend to feature the same kinds of content, they do not all follow the same structure as far as titling of sections is concerned. So what's important to remember from that PowerPoint presentation is what content do you see in an article, not necessarily what are the titles of all of the content. Here we have the third section, which is entitled Empirical Methodology. And this continues the discussion of the author's methods, though as the word empirical suggests, it starts to focus really on the quantitative component rather than the more descriptive language component of the methods. You'll see that the fourth section is results, and if you remember from the PowerPoint, I told you that this section would be labeled typically results or findings. In this section, the author's findings are what are reported on. And remember that often the results section of an article will not actually explain the results, or if it does, it offers just minimal explanation, because the discussion section is really where we get more information, more elaboration on what those findings mean, what's important about them. Here we are at the fifth section, and one thing you want to note about this article is that it doesn't include a section titled Discussion, but the fifth, sixth, and seventh sections actually appear to fulfill the function of a discussion section, because it's in those sections that the authors explain the measures they were testing for and the concepts they explored in relation to their findings. Here we have the conclusion section, which appears on page 718, and it is brief at just 2 paragraphs. Remember that the conclusion functions to first of all summarize the main findings, but then it can go and should go beyond just summary. So in this case, this conclusion will actually also help to reinforce the significance of the research. You'll notice on this page as well that we also have an acknowledgement section, which is where the authors are just giving thanks to those individuals who helped with the article in some way. Below the acknowledgements, we have a reference to the appendix. If a study is complex and involves a lot of data, there usually is an appendix. Sometimes that appendix is attached to the article, and other times it's found somewhere else, depending on the space of the journal. So in this case, we have a URL that will give us access to the appendix. Finally, the last section of this article is the references section, which is just the bibliography. The bibliography, again, provides the full bibliographic citation information for all of the sources that are cited in the article. And if you're familiar with APA style, you'll notice that this bibliography is formatted according to that style. One useful strategy when you're conducting your research is to footnote chase or mine sources. So go through the bibliography and look for additional source materials that are listed here that you think would be useful for you for your paper.